what is or what can be a central observability team or function, and why might companies need one?
I think if you look more broadly, as we mentioned, having a company adopt cloud native, it's not just a technology stack. There's actually big organizational changes. And we sort of see this is that as companies adopt cloud native, historically, perhaps they were more siloed engineering and IT teams that support a particular business unit. But as we start to standardize the infrastructure, the containerization layer of things, what we're seeing is that there are more and more central platform teams now evolving that support all of the business units across a larger enterprise. And observability is no different, right? So historically, perhaps you would have different sets of APM tools or IT monitoring tools in each business unit. But as you migrate to cloud native, generally we see that there's a clear pattern and need to centralize the tooling and centralize the sort of knowledge base and the folks that are responsible to that. So generally a central observability team is you can imagine a team that is responsible for offering observability as a service to the rest of the company and all the business units, and ideally in a central manner. And there's an advantage for that in multiple fold. One aspect of it is that if you can centralize the tooling at least and have one tool set, that's hugely advantageous because you can imagine the sort of skills and the interfaces of every end user can be sort of consistent across an organization, as well as the need to jump across multiple stacks is much higher than it was ever before. So there's a bunch of advantages in a single team picking a single set of tools for sure, but also that single team can do a lot more. Now that it is centralized, they're generally also responsible for things like how do we instrument all of our stack, right? And this is where, as we mentioned at the beginning of this call, things like adopting the open source standards, not just because they're the best for the company in terms of sort of future-proofing themselves, but also so that there is a standard across a whole company is hugely advantageous. But even beyond the sort of standard instrumentations, there are a lot of things that I would say that if you can sort of push out centrally from one organization, it's hugely beneficial to a company. So if you look at some of the additional responsibilities perhaps of a central observability team, they can do things like this where you can imagine every engineer, every developer needs to create, let's say, an SLA or an SLO for their microservice, right? And generally having that requirement is one thing, but like having standardization in how a team measures that, like what is one team's definition of an SLA? How do you really measure it? Because there are many definitions of it. And if you can imagine if that's inconsistent, even if there was a top-down initiative to say, every microservice has to have an SLA. If everybody measures it in a different way, if it's measured from different sources of data, that creates huge amounts of confusion as well. So I think there's a huge role that an observability team can play in that standardization effort, and much higher than just the tooling that you provide, but in how teams think about concepts like an SLA and how they standardize the emission of that data, and perhaps even emitting that data on behalf of the service owner is a huge advantage as well. So I think there's a lot to be gained by centralizing these things. And again, it's not just the observability function, that's one, but again, like for things like security or for deployment, or even the team that owns the core platform in terms of the containerization layer or something like that. There's huge advantages centralizing all of that, because you can sort of, you don't really have to reinvent the wheel per business unit, and there's a lot of advantages that way as well. But yeah,
and I guess coming back to my summary of the last question as well is that they can potentially help bring insights, connected up insights that if teams in silos were just looking at their thing, they might not see.
Yeah, 100%. And a lot of that is, you can imagine if the data is in the same tool set, that enables connecting the insights there. If the data is produced in the same format, you can imagine if you own one part of the stack, but you have a dependency on a different part of the stack, if you can navigate to those dependencies and they measure the things in the same way, they have the same sources of data, they have the same way of defining the SLAs and things like that, you can navigate that team's data without having to go and directly communicate or with them. So there's a bunch of ways that becomes much easier for sure.